Today we're going over the best Pokemon with terrible, horrible, no good, very bad stats, but we're mixing it up a bit. We're not going with the usual triumvirate of Smeargle, Quagsire, and Clefable. They may be the gold standard for this concept, but we've also explored them in depth, and so we're going to go with some unusual options, starting right off with Snover. Yes, Snover. No, this is not a tale of any Eviolite boosted hit-taking heroics. In fact, when Snover first came on the scene, Eviolite didn't even exist. This isn't Little Cup either, where Snover was a star. No, we're going with good old level 100. Of course, Abomasnow was a 100% superior Pokemon in the same way Garchomp is a complete and utter upgrade on Gabite. But what happened when Abomasnow wasn't available? This took place repeatedly in Gens 4 and 5. You would want to unleash the ultimate Hail Terror, Ice Ball Wall Raid, on your opponent, a healing and stall machine that made Poison Heal Gliscor look tame, but Ice Body requires Hail. And what do you know? Abomasnow isn't available in your tier, quite possibly because it got banned for enabling Wall Rain too well. But what, are you going to let that stop you from letting loose the Wall Rain, aka the original Great Tusk? President Barack Obama said, yes we can, and that's exactly what you kept in mind when you put Snover on the team instead of Abomasnow. All it needs to do is set up the Hail. You are willing to effectively play 6v5 in order to activate Wall Rain's peerless stalling capabilities that slice through entire teams as effectively as any Swords Dancer. Heck, even with Abomasnow around, you are stacking Ice types, so it's not like your ideal Hail setter made for a team with the most rock-solid defensive core anyway. But then you get into the game, and you find that Snover is actually not bad. In fact, Snover can be an incredible pain to deal with. It of course has the same unique typing as Abomasnow, which while littered with weaknesses, is also redolent with a tremendous palette of resist. It switches into both water and electric while being neutral to ice, which shut down plenty of standard coverage from Pokemon with such stabs. It wasn't bulky, but with special defense investment, it could get the job done just barely, because of what it did in return. Leech Seed, whose innate effectiveness was boosted immensely by its synergy with Hail. The Ice types immune to Hail were rare. The Grass types immune to Leech Seed didn't like taking super effective Stab Blizzard even from Snover's puny special attack, and thus barring the occasional Magic Guard Pokemon, unless you were in Gen 5 RU, where it'd be Sigilith, which was also Blizzard weak, then most Pokemon switching into Snover would be affected by Leech Seed and Hail, meaning they get worn down fast, while Leech Seed actually worked beautifully in tandem with Snover's low HP, since the health it siphoned off its fully evolved, and thus higher HP opponents, would bring back a huge percentage, helping Snover stick around even with a Stealth Rock weakness. Wall Rain under permanent Hail was so powerful, it would have been used even if Snover did nothing but have Snow Warning activate, but the fact was that Snover helped make Hail as controversial and ban-worthy in so many tiers as it did, because it wasn't just a Hail setting dead slot. Perfectly good teams found themselves deeply irritated by it, and that made the already difficult task of stopping Wall Rain later nearly impossible. And speaking of weather-abusing Leech Seeders, next up we have Cacturne. Cacturne's typing is not without interest, offensively and defensively, but both of these are offset by the fact that it is ridiculously slow and frail. It has a neat set of useful resists, but it's also not at all hard to hit super effectively, and even neutral attacks deck it with ease. Base 115 offenses are nice, but these aren't even that high considering its stabs, which aren't especially powerful or synergistic. In Gen 3, its grass stabs are Hidden Power Grass at 70 base power and Needle Arm or Giga Drain at 60, while its Dark Stab is HP Dark or the 60 base power Feint Attack. While it gets better in 4 and 5, it's still nothing game-breaking, going up to 80 with Energy Ball, Seed Bomb, and Dark Pulse. At least the physical special split lets it use Swords Dance and Sucker Punch effectively. However, there's a reason Cacturne has been the Pokemon that has repeatedly demonstrated Sandville's brokenness once Garchomp and Gliscor have been dealt with. It shows that it's not just an ability that breaks already great Pokemon, but an ability whose consistent guaranteeing of free turns makes an otherwise ineffective NU Pokemon into one that can quite easily run over powerful teams, even with its stats being, well, pathetic. Sandville discussions were always bogged down with the same counter arguments. Really? Cacturne with these stats? And yes, base 55 speed is appallingly bad. It's the same as Blissey and less than Swampert on a Pokemon with such abysmal bulk that it can barely even switch into moves it resists, let alone take a hit to save its life. But that's just it. With Sandville, Cacturne doesn't have to take a hit. And turns out when that's the case, yes really, Cacturne with this move pool will in fact run you over. Giving free turns to a Pokemon that hides behind substitutes tends to be scary in general, but when it's dishing out Spikes and Leech Seed, you don't need to have Ferrothorn's walling abilities when you get to bombard the opponent with these, especially with Sandstorm enhancing their effect and nothing being immune to both of them. Cacturne being quite threatening against the Pokemon that resist either. Most notably, it completely destroys many variants of Celebi, Gen 3's foremost Leech Seed user and immunity. Its indirect damage quickly spirals out of control, especially when Needle Arm's nasty 30% flitch rate gets involved. Since Sandville's free turn fishing style makes such an effective pairing with Paralysis, and once its it starts source dancing in Gen 4, the direct damage is quite terrifying as well. Cacture's low stats meant nothing when it ran circles around you, if not run over you, as you repeatedly haplessly flailed against his substitutes. Now for another dark type that somehow worked around its poor bulk, we have Sableye. Sableye did so in spite of a base stat total significantly lower than Mightyena's, which would have been low on a Pokemon not fully evolved, and it did so en route to becoming a wall, or more accurately, a Pokemon utilized and expected to take hits. It certainly wasn't going to be pulling off any offense, so utility was all that was left to it, but it seemingly wasn't left with much to that end either. Useful as the fighting immunity was, its Dark Ghost typing wasn't exactly otherwise loaded with useful resist, and Sableye's stats were horrifyingly low. There was a common problem where Pokemon with huge defenses were let down by low HP. This wasn't Sableye's issue. Its low HP also came with low defenses. It was notably less specially bulky than Cacturne, and only bulkier physically by a tad. Lower defenses can still lead to bulky Pokemon when EV invested, but this generally works for Pokemon with high or at least workable HP, such as specially defensive Hippowdon and Skarmory respectively. Oh, and if that's not bad enough, it has no speed to speak of either. Somehow, Sableye managed, just barely, to actually take some decent hits. The fact that it actually healed with Recover was major. In Gen 3, it completely stifled Snorlax's normal stab while being neutral to both Shadow Ball and Earthquake, and utilized that same EQ neutrally en route to safely blocking Claydol's Rapid Spin and Psychic, while knocking off opponents' leftovers in return, since it had yet to even gain Will-O-Wisp. But Sableye's real OU hit-taking came in Gen 5, once it gained the Prankster ability. Giving priority to Recover was one thing, but going first with the Wisp it gained in Gen 4 was huge. Now it was effectively bulkier, Will-O-Wisp accuracy willing, since it could burn physical attackers before it hit them. Priority Taunt also allowed it to shut down potential boosts from Swords Dance and Dragon Dance. It was just barely able to take those hits, but since it could so effectively recover before it got attacked, it was indeed able to take them effectively, since it would also heal them off. But what of special attacks? Aside from the fact that most special attackers also didn't care for burn damage, Sableye could, despite it not having Prankster, also use Snarl, lowering the opponent's special attack and thus allowing it to even stay in against the mighty Specs Latios Draco Meteor. EVing Sableye was tricky, since it couldn't excel at taking hits on even one side, even with full investment, let alone both. Even burn outrages could be threatening sometimes. But if using Snarl over the standard Nightshade, special defense Sableye could indeed pull some neat tricks, especially if it got a second Snarl off against something like Keldeo, first on the switch, second as it takes the Hydro Pump, then Recover up, forcing the attacker out and thus racking up hazard damage. It also helped that Sableye's typing, flawed though it was, also gave it an immunity to Psychic and Focus Blast, thus allowing it to uniquely blank Gen 5's defining Magic Guard Psychics Alakazam and Reuniclus, since it was also neutral to all their other coverage options. As a bonus, even Mega Sableye falls under this category. It's got a sizable boost to its bulk, sure, but its HP is still low. Its Recover no longer goes first, and it doesn't even have the passive heal of leftovers. Of course, the power of its Magic Bounce ability makes even such a frail Pokemon incredibly hard to break through, even getting banned in Gen 6. Now on the subject of crazy abilities, we have Magneton. And no, this isn't just from the days of Magnezone not existing. Magneton continued to be a viable choice even when Magnezone was available, able to fulfill critical niches its evolution could not. However, even before Magnezone came around, Magneton was a solid example of a genuinely good Pokemon with low stats. It had great special attack and solid defense, but the latter was undercut by paltry HP and unimpressive speed, which also made its meager special defense easy to prey on. And yet it was a crucial part of Gen 3 OU, utilizing its Magnapole for the invaluable task of removing Skarmory. But even outside of Skarmory trapping, it regularly found some value. Its quadruple resist to Metagross's Choice Band Meteor Mash was excellent, and it completely stifled Hidden Power Flyings from Banded Salamence and Aerodactyl, while managing to just barely be bulky enough to pivot into other Choice Banded attacks like Tyranitar's Rock Slide. In Gen 4, its performance relative to its lack of stats just became more impressive, as it was competing in a significantly power-crept world. Magnezone's strength over it wasn't just its higher power, but its bulk. It was actually able to pivot into the Draco Meteors and Outrages defining the new metagame, which even Magneton's Resist didn't make it comfortable switching into. However, Magneton eventually became just as popular as its evolution, if not more so, because of the significantly higher speed it boasted, putting it at a critical speed tier for the Choice Scarf set that became one of the most important Pokemon in the game for how it held all manner of teams together, offense, balance, and stall. It removed Skarmory and helped with Jirachi, yes, but it did so while outspeeding the trio of Dragon Dancers, Gyarados, Dragonite, and Tyranitar, which Scarf Magnezone failed to do. Scarf Magnezone couldn't even outrun non-Scarf Starmie. Magneton's lower bulk meant it had to be significantly more careful about switching in, but even in this power-crept physical special split world, it could still take hits like Gyarados' Waterfall well enough to let its user play around the Dragon Dance threat without instantly risking its KO. The pivotal difference in speed between the Mags saw its most prominent metagame effect in Magneton arguably eclipsing its evolution in Gen 4. But though Magnezone was far and away preferred occurred in the subsequent generations, Magneton was still viable, mostly in Gen 5, where Scarf Magneton's extra speed allowed it to outrun the new meta-defining threat that leaves Scarf Zone in the dust, Magic Guard Alakazam. Now on for another low-stat trapper, we have Dugtrio and Diglett. In terms of hit-taking, Dugtrio makes Magneton look like Lugia. In fact, Dugtrio is physically frailer than Magnemite, and by quite a bit. This is the necessary trade-off though, for the fact that the scope of its trapping is so much vaster. Whereas Magnapole just targeted steel types, Arena Trap targets everything that's grounded, and whereas even when Magneton was used over Magnezone for its higher speed, it still wasn't fast. Whereas Dugtrio boasts the same speed tier as the mighty Alakazam. Be that as it may, Dugtrio was not just ridiculously frail, but not especially powerful either. In Gen 7, it's got its attack boosted to base 100, aka the same level of power Flygon was struggling with as far back as Gen 4, and Dugtrio didn't have a stab whose power could match Outrage. Pre-Gen 7, Dugtrio was working with base 80. Even boosted by Choice Band, this isn't exactly guaranteeing KOs against even many Earthquake-weak targets. But in perhaps the most deceptive case of bulk yet, even Dugtrio managed, though it was a precarious balancing act for sure, to hit the field against its targets regularly. It was at its best when aided by teammates using switch moves to be sure, followed by coming in off of an accurately predicted double switch, but if it needed, it could actually hard switch into its target's coverage moves, like Heatran's Earth Power or sometimes even their stabs, in the case of say Jirachi's Psychic. Starting in Gen 5 though, with the introduction of both Team Preview and the Stealth Rock denying Magic Bounce, though the latter wasn't always necessary, Dugtrio's standard set became Focus Sash, which if maintained, allowed it to bypass its frailty, or in fact to use it to its advantage. It could switch right into Kyurem Black Ice Beam, be brought down to 1 HP, and bam, there's a max power reversal for the trap. Then there was the issue of power, and yes, pre-Gen 7, when not targeting Heatran's quadruple ground weakness, no matter how critical a target this was, Dugtrio could indeed come up short. If you tried to pick off bulky teams from full health, the thing was its targets were key Pokemon like Tyranitar and Jirachi, which regularly switched into battle and were thus knocked into Dugtrio range without even trying. In Gen 4, something as innocuous as a Zapdos U-turn against T-Tar would get the job done. Dugtrio also regularly picked off Pokemon it wasn't expected to trap either, something like Offensive Swampert, whose neutrality to Doug's moves alongside natural physical bulk suggests a Pokemon not vulnerable to Dugtrio would take some damage in the course of its dealing damage, and thus would get picked off by a banded Earthquake once being lowered to around half health. Sometimes though, Dugtrio didn't even need to KO its targets, but to simply bring it low enough to where it couldn't do its job anymore. In Gen 7, sometimes it just needed to land a Toxic on a certain Pokemon, like Tapu Bulu, in order to completely swing a matchup. To have so much control over the opponent, rendering them unable to preserve the health of a Pokemon otherwise required from the matchup, was far too powerful. One could point out Dugtrio had horrendous stats all they wanted. It was so effective in this role that Diglett was used, and while obviously far worse, still got the job done against Tyranitar and Heatran. Now for a Pokemon Dugtrio was sometimes trapped with its Aerial Ace, should Substitute or Swords Dance Mach Punch not be involved, we have Breloom. Breloom rocked OU for generations despite those seemingly fatal flaws, being both slow and frail. Its upsides went a long way in transcending these flaws, but when it leaned into bulky sets, it made the most of its typing's unique resistances and the tremendous unique recovery and resilience of Poison Heal alongside Leech Seed, and starting in Gen 5, a buffed Drain Punch to become among the most difficult Pokemon to KO, even on its lower special defense stat with investment. Not bad for something with less special bulk than Magneton. Still, its primary attractions were indeed its massive attack stat, and of course the auto shutdown of Spore, but it was far from just a sleep machine either. In Gens 4 and 5, Sleep was eventually banned, while starting in Gen 6, Grass types became immune to Spore. Of course, it was still a major weapon of Breloom's, but it was still incredibly effective without it, as it had also ran excellent Sporeless sets even before Sleep was banned in Gens 4 and 5. In Gen 3, where it never was without Spore, it also didn't have access to physical Grass Stab yet, and would sometimes get checked by Swampert unless it lured Swampert with special hidden power Grass. Quirk aside, Breloom was such a ferocious attacker, at first because of the raw power of Stab Focus Punch, then because of the repeated opportunities to bombard the opponent afforded by Poison Heal's recovery and status blocking, then because of Technicians elevating its Grass Stab's power even further, as well as making its Mach Punch strong enough to negate its low speed, just as Scizor does with its equally powerful Bullet Punch. Breloom also has the benefit of the tech-boosted speed-dropping low sweep, making it even tougher to pivot around its attacks with faster checks like Latios. Unlike Scizor though, it didn't have the benefit of half-steel typing or genuinely good bulk, allowing it to switch into it in the first place. And yet Breloom wound up a lot more apt at taking hits than you'd think, really pushing the idea of a little going a long way, with just a bit of EV investment, allowing it to do things like stay in against monsters like Garchomp and Specs Keldeo, and even that low speed tended to be just enough to get the jump on defensive fixtures like Rotom Wash. Now next Next up, we have a trio of Pokemon with Ditto, Pyukumuku, and Clodsire, sort of. These three mirror the obvious three of Smeargle, Clefable, and Quagsire that we mentioned in the intro. Well, for the most part. Clodsire is the most obvious point of comparison to Quagsire, and yet nobody could accuse it of having low stats, at least in terms of the special bulk, which is its stock in trade. Its base 100 special defense is higher than anything of Quagsire's, and that's before taking into account its absolutely staggering 130 HP, which is significantly more than Arceus. When special defense Clodsire answers a special attacker, it's more, well, I sure hope it would. However, in fairness, Clodsire does have some incredibly low stats. It's weaker, slower, and has far lower physical defense than Quagsire, who was already not doing great, to say the least, in any of these categories, and thus Clodsire does largely follow in the tradition of leaning on Unaware or Water Absorb to enable its walling, rather than letting its stats do the work for it. When invested, it also does take physical hits quite well for a Pokemon with Cacturn tier defense. Then there's Pyukumuku, aka the other Unaware Pokemon in Gen 7, similar to how Clefable offered a non-Quagsire alternative to some terrifying boosting sweepers. Pyukumuku does have some seriously impressive defenses, but is constantly having to navigate how they crash into its awful HP and the fact that it gets outsped by everything. Literally, its base 5 speed is tied with Shuckle and Munchlax for the lowest in the entire game. Its speed isn't the only stat that functionally doesn't exist either, as its offenses are also pathetic, but seeing as it quite literally doesn't learn any moves that deal direct damage, the closest it comes is counter. Its offenses also may as well not exist either, and yet despite being the ultimate passive wall with low HP interfering with even hit taking, Pyukumuku leverages not just Unaware, but a surprisingly thorny support move pool into being quite threatening for a Pokemon that literally can't hurt you. Toxic is par for the course, but getting trapped by Block and PP stalled by Spite is real nasty work. Finally, there's Ditto, as a sort of parallel to Smeargle. It too could learn any move, but once it gained the Auto Transform Imposter ability in Gen 5, Ditto of course went further with being able to become any Pokemon as well. Whatever broken or powerful strategy your opponent was going to throw at you, they better be able to withstand it themselves. If you could dish it but couldn't take it, nothing would make you pay like Ditto. You might think the fact that Ditto transformed upon switching in meant its initially awful stats pretty much didn't exist, but there was one notable exception. Even after transforming, it kept its appalling base 48 HP, which tended to severely undercut the defenses of whatever it might be copying, meaning it really had to be careful about switching in and taking hits in general. With Choice Scarf, it may be a faster version of whatever it was copying, but it was a significantly frailer version as well. Still, being so uniquely positioned to Uno reverse your opponent meant the low HP was something you'd work around. Now for our finale, a Pokemon so defining and powerful, most people don't realize that Talonflame's base attack is lower than that of Amoongus's. Not exactly what you'd expect of a physical attacker. Talonflame was immensely powerful in both singles and doubles. Its Gale Wings Brave Birds becoming Gen 6's shorthand for a standard, effective, popular strategy spammed to the point of boredom, much like Scizor's Bullet Punch and U-Turn had been in Gens 4 and 5. It certainly wasn't without its flaws though, most notably Stealth Rock in singles, but strangely enough, its stats being too low didn't really hold it back. And this really is strange because those stats are not what you'd expect of a Pokemon so capable of running both offensive and defensive sets. It does have a stat that's undeniably great. It's base 126 speed, but if there was ever a Pokemon that almost didn't need it, it's Talonflame, since it's going first with its most important moves, not just Brave Bird, but Roost as well. Of course, it's not like it doesn't utilize the speed well with other moves like Flare Blitz and Will-O-Wisp, but this is decidedly secondary, so much so that its defensive sets did speed investment completely in favor of bulk, and boy does it need it, because base 78 HP, 71 defense, and 69 special defense is incredibly meager, yet with its Gale Wings move supported by the rest of Talonflame's superb move pool, whether it's Swords Dance, Bulk Up, Taunt, or Will-O-Wisp, it manages to just barely manage a plethora of powerful attacks in Sableye-esque fashion. What's especially impressive is that it often does this without leftovers, which it runs in order to utilize Acrobatics as its Gale Wing stab instead of Brave Bird, trading in power for a lack of recoil, as well as an ability to switch into knockoff without taking the high-powered first strike where the item is removed. The offensive sets are easier to understand, even though base 81 attack is seriously low even by old gen standards, let alone as far into the power creep game as Gen 6. But in addition to Brave Bird being an incredibly strong move to always go first with, the fact that both its stabs are so high-powered goes quite far in being able to split the difference, especially with the heightened immediacy of Choice Band, whose instantaneous threat was such that even Resist could find themselves quickly overwhelmed by repeated hits, something you would expect more of Draco Meteor level moves from a Pokemon with a base attacking stat over 100, or should it get the free turn opportunity, the high-powered boosting of Swords Dance, really letting it put games away. The mediocrity of Talonflame stats really showed once it could no longer rely on Gale Wings in Gen 7, as the ability was nerfed to only work at full health, just like Multiscale. But in its defining debut Gen 6, Talonflame was an offensive defensive threat with stats that would have been low by the standards of an early gen lower tier. And thank you so much to our platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Espion Lover, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.